Hey everyone, this is Derrick Broze with the Conscious Resistance Network and 90.1 KPFT Houston. Today we're bringing you another guest in our series asking questions about COVID-19, pandemic, panic, depending on how you look at it, and just exploring the many different ideas floating around this. Those of you who've been following lately, I recently did a COVID-19 whiteboard just to try to explore all the different theories that are out there because there are many of them, and I think it's overwhelming to some people. So we're trying to basically pick apart that whiteboard piece by piece. And today we'll be looking at some of the things I mentioned on there as we're talking with Dr. Andrew Kaufman. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. Thanks, Derrick.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on to talk. I know you've been busy and making the rounds of some different channels and getting your work out there and your name out there. So I want to talk about, of course, COVID-19 and your thoughts and your research on that. But let's start with first your credentials, your background, your educational experience, what you're bringing to the conversation today.
Yeah, sure. Well, let's see. I graduated from MIT undergraduate, and I was actually a physician assistant earlier in my career, and I worked in cancer medicine with some very ill people in a hospital setting. Then I went back to medical school in Charleston, South Carolina, and decided to specialize in psychiatry. So I went to do my training at Duke, and then after that, did a fellowship in forensic psychiatry, which is like the intersection of mental health and the law. I did that in upstate New York at one of the state universities. And after that, I joined the faculty and held several leadership positions there and conducted and published research. And I also had a startup medical device company for a device that I invented and patented. And after a while, I kind of got a little bit fed up of academic medicine and the politics and other aspects of that. So I decided to just do some consulting on my own. And I've been doing that for the last few years and started learning about other types of medicine besides mainstream allopathic medicine because I was very disenfranchised that the patients were not responding to psychiatric medications, with rare exceptions. And I read a book by Kelly Brogan, actually called The Mind of Your Own, and she's another psychiatrist who went off the beaten path. And I tried her protocol, and for the first time, worked with a patient that I was able to cure from anxiety. And by a means that I had no idea would work. And so I knew there was something really important there. So I spent the last several years studying and learning about other methods of healing, which I call natural healing, because it's basically relying on your own body to heal itself. And you're just providing the right environmental conditions, which usually has to do with nutrition and detoxification. And I've had great results using this. I started to work with clients in a consultation model, and it's been just amazing.
Well, thank you for sharing all that. I'm just curious, did you come across, I imagine you did, or are you familiar with Dr. Peter Bregin's work?
Absolutely. Actually, Dr. Breggin is pretty nearby where I am geographically. And a number of years ago, I attended some alternative conferences in my local area that he was actually running. And so we did have a chance to meet. And I even was an expert witness on the other side in a lawsuit that he was involved in. So we've definitely had some interactions. And his book Toxic Psychiatry is there's a lot of truth in there. And I know that he takes a lot of kids off psychiatric medications. And that's something also that I've done. That was really the only way I could continue to practice in a traditional setting, was to be able to do that and try to minimize the harm from the psychiatric medications, especially in children. I work with adolescents. And then, trying to integrate a little bit of other means of healing. It's difficult in a conventional setting, but yeah, Dr. Breggin has definitely been somewhat of a pioneer in psychiatry.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing all that of your background. And so like you said, you started to, after having maybe what we could call a more traditional or mainstream medical education, you said you start to look into what we're going to refer to as natural healing. And I'm assuming it's along that path that you started to question the nature of viruses and obviously what we're dealing with, COVID-19. So why don't we start to get into that and bring us up to, I guess we could start with, what do you think that are the main flaws in the mainstream theory about COVID-19, which is that, let's just go with the most mainstream, that it came from a seafood market in Wuhan and, you know, transferred to humans, et cetera, et cetera. What are the major flaws and the, I guess, the pieces of your thesis that differ from what we're being told?
Right. Well, you know, it certainly is not a big logical leap to see that if some people get sick from a seafood market, especially one like in Wuhan, where they don't have the best sanitary conditions, that, you know, someone could get food poisoning from that. When the first, you know, people got sick with a respiratory illness in China, they didn't really consider those possibilities that it could be a toxin or a contaminant from the environment. They pretty much went right to the virus explanation. And I think that's been a major paradigm in medical research all the way back to the 1930s when the electron microscope was invented, because they had this idea based on germ theory already that there was some unseen microbe, you know, a miniature organism, a microorganism that was causing these illnesses that they didn't find bacteria in. And so they said, well, there's got to be some other infectious agent. And when they finally saw these teeny tiny particles under the microscope, you know, they had this moment where they said, look, there it is, there's the virus, right? And the term actually means poison from the Latin. So it's a little bit conflated there. And then all of the subsequent research was all based on you know, that this is a virus that comes from outside your body and invades it and causes disease, which is basically germ theory. So for me, in my learning about medicine and natural healing, I mean, I first started just kind of looking at the healthcare system and looking at the evidence that any of the treatments are successful. And what I found is that actually it's most likely healthcare is the leading cause of death in our country. And there are some very mainstream studies that have been out that show that. And if you do a little bit more research, you can easily get that number up into near 1 million people a year. So that was very disheartening. And but on the other side, so I started looking into what can work, what will help people without causing harm. And one of the things that I eventually got to was germ theory. Because really, I think all of the modern medicine is built on germ theory. It has this sort of warfare model that you know, we're stricken with an illness that there's nothing we could do about it or do to control it, and we have some kind of invader or some other thing like cancer is looked at in this model too, right? You've heard of the war on cancer. And that was actually a research program to find viruses that cause cancer, interestingly, and it was a major failure. Those scientists only were able to continue doing research when the AIDS epidemic came out, and they all switched to HIV. Otherwise, their funds had dried up. So since they were, you know, so when I started looking at germ theory and started to look at the research that they said supports the fact that these microorganisms cause disease, I saw all sorts of shortcomings in what they were doing. Like, for example, the model that was used by like Pasteur and his contemporaries, and, you know, Pasteur gets a lot of credit for germ theory, but it wasn't his idea. And he actually stole a lot of research from Antoine Béchamp, who is a real serious scientist. But what they did is they used fermentation as a model for infection. And fermentation, you know, is when microorganisms break down plant material to make, you know, vinegar or alcohol. So, you know, they're saying that how you make wine is the same as what happens in our body when we get sick. And so that is, you know, it's a difficult model to accept. But I think that it also came from the observation that when they looked at people's illness and they saw diseased tissue under the microscope, they saw bacteria. But that doesn't mean that the bacteria caused the illness, but they made that assumption. You know, it would kind of be like if you show up at a house that is on fire, right, and you see the firefighters there, would you blame the firefighters for causing the fire? Right? And that's kind of the logic that they use to reason this. And they actually came up with a set of rules that's credited to Robert Koch. That's a hard word to say, but try to say it in the proper German pronunciation. And it's just a set of common sense rules. There's 4 rules of how you prove that a microorganism causes a disease. And it was, you know, pretty much accepted by everyone on a consensus. But when I looked into, well, have those rules actually been satisfied? I couldn't find any evidence that they've been satisfied for any disease. And for some diseases, it's kind of obvious that they're not satisfied. And I'll give you an example of that. So the first rule is pretty straightforward, that there has to be an illness that has a set of symptoms that's recognizable, right? And we all can name plenty of illnesses like that. And you have to be able to identify that microorganism in those sick people with those symptoms, but not in healthy people, right? Because if it's in healthy people also, well, how could it be the cause of the disease? And so we're all familiar with strep throat, right? Which we're told is caused by the bacteria Streptococcus. And they give us antibodies. They take a culture of our throat and grow that bacteria. Well, Streptococcus, as it turns out, is a normal part of our microbiome. So in other words, it's present in everybody. So if we took a bunch of healthy people and cultured their throat for Streptococcus, a significant portion of them would be positive and they'd be perfectly healthy. So, right there, it fails right at the first step, and you don't need to do any more research after that. And that's the kind of thing I found for everything I've looked into so far, including viruses.
So you're just to be clear, so you're not just stating that we haven't got to the specifics of COVID-19 yet, but not just COVID-19, but obviously you just said strep throat and other diseases like this. They do not satisfy Koch's postulates. Is that what
Absolutely. Like I haven't found any proof of any infectious microorganism satisfying Koch's postulates. I mean, not one. I haven't looked at every different disease, but I have spoken with other researchers who have looked at things that I haven't looked at, and they found the same thing.
Gotcha.
So,
okay. So let's just clarify a little more. So what we were discussing, which is the commonly held belief that I guess everybody gets in junior high biology, is germ theory, right? And you're saying that the evidence that you've seen doesn't even line up with the criteria that has been set forth by the scientific community to define what a virus is, what a disease is, et cetera. And opposing that is, if I'm correct, what is known as terrain theory. Is that more in line with what you believe in, or what you are stating is more likely to be true?
yeah, so that's a great point, right? Because they didn't even prove it by their own rules, right? Not by some outside set of rules that was put upon them, right? By their own rules. And so terrain theory is what I think is much more accurate. And it basically says that the disease is caused by, some other factor, and that the bacteria actually come to the site of the disease and serve the same role that they do in nature that we've all observed them serve, which is to clean up and recycle the area. And so, like, if you walk through the woods and you see, a pile of dead plant debris, right, you'll see that they're rotting because the microorganisms are decomposing it so that the elements can go back into nature and be reused by other organisms, right? So it's a very natural process. And the same thing happens inside our body. So let's say that like toxic exposure is one of the main causes of disease. So we could look back at strep throat, that you're eating something or you're exposed to some environmental toxin that irritates the tissue in your throat and causes this disease there. And you may not have a lot of symptoms during that phase of the disease. But then after that is arrested, either the exposure goes away, your body's able to get rid of the junk, and it resolves it somehow. Well, then the body calls in the bacteria to come and clean up the site, get rid of all the debris, and restore it so that it can, regrow and back to basically new tissue. And our body is like renewing itself all the time. So this is a standard process. And I know people will have this question. So if you treat someone with antibiotics, and let me remind you that antibiotic means against life, right? Anti against, and bios is life. So the bacteria that come to respond to do this cleanup work, they're working in concert with the immune system, and they do secrete some toxins of their own or some chemicals of their own that cause like inflammation and secretions. And that's actually a way to get the material that's a waste product out of the body. So when you have that runny nose and swollen tissues, the tissues are swollen because there's more blood coming in, right? Bringing nutrients to rebuild the tissue and taking away waste products. And the secretions are to flush out the waste products. So it's part of the healing process. And that's actually the healing phase of the illness. But when you take antibiotics during that time, because that is the most uncomfortable part of it, you do relieve the symptoms because all of those chemical factors that were causing the inflammation and the secretions go away because the bacteria are all dead. But what happens is that you didn't actually allow the healing to be complete. And I think this is one of the main reasons why people get recurrent infections of various types, like kids get ear infections over and over again, or some people get sinus infections over and over again. And I think it's because the antibiotics interrupts the healing cycle, and then the body has to recreate that illness in order to completely repair the tissue.
Okay, so let me recap that a little bit. So as far like terrain theory is basically saying the terrain, which is obviously our body, let's say internally and externally, if you're not healthy, basically, if you don't have a strong immune system, if you're eating like crap and you're just being exposed to different toxins, is it correct that then your body will try to start healing itself, which is going to start excreting, like you were just saying a moment ago, which I believe are referred to as exosomes, correct?
Well, I didn't really
connected?
cover, I mean, I can talk about exosomes in this context, but I was really mostly talking about the bacteria and fungi.
Okay. Well, yeah, let's not jump ahead then. We'll save exosomes for a moment. I just want to make sure I'm like getting as you're going through this, the process though. So yeah, the body starts to try to heal itself is what you were saying, right?
Absolutely. And, here's a really interesting thing that I'm not even sure if you're aware of, but I've seen this under a microscope. So I know that it's accurate. And there are some excellent scientists that came right on the coattails of the germ theory movement when they were exploring terrain theory. And what they found is that actually these bacteria and fungi actually come from inside our own cells. So in traditional medicine, or I shouldn't really call it traditional because that's more like, Chinese medicine or Native American medicine, but in allopathic medicine, whenever you look at tissue under the microscope, it's always dead tissue because the technology that they use requires you to stain the tissue, and then you have to use a fixative like formaldehyde in order to stain the tissue. So you can't observe any behavior of the cells. But if you use a dark field microscope, and this is the kind of microscope that Royal Rife developed and improved the technology substantially, but unfortunately that was lost. You can observe living cells. So if you just take a blood sample and look at red blood cells under the microscope, you see these little specks of light inside the cells. And when the person is in a disease state, you can actually see little things budding out of the cells. And those have been called either somatids or protids, depending on which scientist research you're looking at. And they go through this cycle, it's called a cyclogeny, and they exhibit what's called pleomorphism, which means they can change their shape. And this is, pleomorphism has been observed in microorganisms in mainstream science, so this is nothing really weird. But these things bud out of the cell, and then they go through this cycle, and they develop and differentiate into a mature bacteria or fungus. And there seem to be specific species that respond to different disease states. So some doctors that are very sophisticated in this analysis, they can actually, using the microscope and a couple of other things, they can figure out the nature of the illness based on the species of bacteria and fungi that they see in the blood in this cyclogeny. So this is really fascinating, and actually was initially demonstrated by Béchamp, like who I mentioned before, was the guy that Pasteur stole a lot of experiments from. And he used the fermentation model initially, and then the putrefaction, which is the breakdown of animal tissue, to show that fermentation could take place without any source of microbes from the outside, right? So because originally, and germ theory was based on that the microbe has to come from the air in order to do the fermentation, right? So it basically comes from outside of us and invades us. But Béchamp showed that if you seal it off, that there's no access to the air, that it still takes place, the fermentation. So that that was the first indication that the microorganisms come from within inside the plant itself. And then later on, some scientists like Gaston Naessens and Enderlein used the microscope, as I described, to observe this process and characterize it, and put it in textbooks and such. But it was never adopted by the allopathic medical research machine. So that's why I never knew about this. But I've seen, you can go on YouTube actually, and you can find videos where they'll put a blood sample under the microscope and they'll describe what you're seeing. And it matches exactly with the diagrams that they would show from the textbook that describe this cycle. So it's really kind of amazing. And this was discovered long before we knew about the microbiome. But it fits perfectly with this, because it's our body's way of replenishing all of the microorganisms. They've been estimated to outnumber our human cells by 10 to 1.
So if I could ask for your personal opinion or personal speculation on that, why do you think that the allopathic machine, as you called it, stands to benefit or prefers one theory over the other? What's the benefit of, it sounds like basically without the knowledge that you just shared, if that is actually factual, keeping that information from people is ending up causing more harm to their body rather than working with the body's natural process.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And, so I don't have, this is purely my ideas, because I don't have direct knowledge of why people at that stage would have, kept this outside of the mainstream. But, they really adopted germ theory before it was really a settled science, right? That's why we still call it germ theory, because it's not germ law, right? It's a theory. And, but it does serve, let's say, if you look at this from the perspective of Rockefeller, right? Because Rockefeller, once he, got really wealthy and had his oil production facilities going, he was looking for ways to expand the business. And so you could make petrochemicals into pharmaceutical drugs. And so he formed this group, and they went around and researched all the medical schools in the country and issued this report called the Exner Report. And essentially what it said was that the only medicine that really works is pharmaceuticals, radiation, and surgery. Before that time, the majority of medical schools in the United States were either naturopathic or homeopathic. Sorry, I always confuse homeo and osteo. And after that report was issued, and it had something to do with the formation of the AMA, his group basically went around and closed a bunch of medical schools that were not allopathic. And then they funded the allopathic medical schools with big, endowments. And in exchange for that, put their own people on all the board of directors for the medical school. So they had this direct influence over the curriculum. And the curriculum in medical school, for me, many years later, was really all about just matching the treatment to the disease. But this model basically would say that, we have no control over the cause of disease. It's just something that happens to us beyond our control. It's bad luck. There's nothing we can do about it, right? And that lends itself to having to go seek someone who's a professional or an expert in order to help you, because there's nothing you could do yourself. You can't understand it. You don't have any role in causing it or bringing it about. Right. So it kind of violates some of the basic hermetic principles there, like cause and effect. And so it makes people dependent on the system in order to have good health. And, the other part of it is, and this doesn't apply as much to infectious disease, but all of these chronic illnesses, right? They also were told that we don't know what causes them. Many times they say it's probably a virus. Right? There's lots of diseases like that, like chronic fatigue syndrome, for example. I mentioned about the war on cancer before. So rheumatoid arthritis, type 1 diabetes, all of these illnesses, there's a lot of research looking for some kind of, bacteria or virus or parasitic organism as the cause. But with all these chronic illnesses, there's, because we don't know what the real cause is, we don't know how to cure it. And so then the person becomes a lifelong patient. So the pharmaceutical model is that it will provide some relief from symptoms, but not a cure. In fact, in medical school, I almost never heard the word cure. But doing natural medicine, I've actually found that almost all of these diseases that we're told there's no cure for can be completely reversed.
Okay, well, I appreciate you sharing your view on that. I generally agree with that. For those who haven't looked into that history, what he stated is fact as far as the Rockefeller taking over the American Medical Institute and American Medical Association and just infiltrating their way into medicine and all areas of our life, which coincidentally seems to be continuing into today with COVID-19 and everything we're seeing there. So let's bring it now up to the conversation about COVID-19 based on what you've already told us, stating that there is not actual evidence of isolating various viruses and illnesses, and I'm assuming that you will say COVID-19 continues that pattern. And what does that mean for what we're seeing here? Like, in your view, are you stating that COVID-19, there's no such thing as this virus, or people are getting sick from something else? Like, where how does this affect what we're hearing? And somebody who's hearing this conversation who says, well, hey, I know somebody who's sick, or I know somebody who's in the hospital, how does that work together with what you're proposing?
Yeah, well, it can be very, very difficult to figure out what's going on at the ground level because, you might see people sick or you might even see people die, but you don't really know what they're sick from or what they're dying from. Even for me, without seeing like their chart or being able to examine them, I would only be able to speculate. So what I've done is I've looked at this two ways. I've looked at, one is the evidence for that they found a virus and shown that it actually causes a disease. And then I've also looked at, what is the overall effect to the population in terms of mortality. And that tells a very interesting and telling story. And so, for example, I just had Dr. Jennifer Daniels on my show yesterday and interviewed her. And she gave me some really interesting information that she's looked at the year-to-date mortality statistics in the United States. And this jives with lots of evidence that I've looked at as well. And she said that basically year-to-date in the United States, mortality is down 30 to 35% compared to last year. So how could we have some kind of dangerous new illness that's killing people if actually, tens of thousands less people are dying than did last year at this time? And it's important to look at the all-cause mortality because the CDC and all the state health agencies have given these directives to basically put COVID-19 as the cause of death on many, many death certificates where there's no proof that it was the cause of death, like even lung cancer patients, for example. I even heard about somebody who died of end-stage Alzheimer's disease, and they said it was from COVID-19, right? So that just doesn't really fit. So why would there be actually less people dying this year if there's a new disease? I actually think one of the main reasons there are less people dying this year is because they're not able to get medical care because the hospitals are all empty pretty much. And the beds that they have available for people with general illness, like not COVID-related illness, has shrunken down to almost nothing. All elective surgeries and appointments have been canceled. They're laying off nurses and pharmacists and other healthcare professionals across the country because there's not enough business in the hospital. And I think that's actually saving a lot of people from deaths related to medical care. Like Johns Hopkins did a big study showing 250,000 people a year die from medical care. They call it medical errors, but if you look at their definition, it's really medical care. And there's another study in the Journal of the American Medical Association where that reports that 128,000 people a year die from taking prescription drugs as directed. So not like an intentional overdose or an accident, but actually taking them as they're meant to be taken. So that right there, you combine those two numbers together, it's 378,000 a year, and that's higher than the third leading cause of death, according to the CDC. So if these people are not getting that health care right now, they're staying alive longer. And I think that's what's reflected in the numbers. And, some of that is related to not driving because people are staying at home and they're not dying in car accidents. But that number is much, much lower.
Well, let me interject real quick if you don't mind.
Please.
I agree with you on I have trouble trusting any of the numbers. Let's just say that, right?
Oh,
From
me
trying
too.
to follow John Hopkins, and then of course the WHO and the CDC, as well as friends and some contacts in hospitals in Michigan and New York as well. So I'm getting a mix of various angles from all sides, from folks who definitely have been following your work and people who've been asking me to have this conversation with you and sharing your videos, to those on the other side, my friends who I think might be, I don't want to say they're paying attention to too much mainstream news, but they are fully sucked into thinking that things are apocalyptic or about to be, apocalyptic, to some degree, right? But very educated people who are paying attention and might also not be sure the numbers, but maybe the other way, they think that there's false negatives, right? And then false positives. I guess my main question here is, because I'm also seeing studies, and this is what I'm trying to, I guess, grapple with. I'm seeing studies that are talking about mutations of the virus, multiple strains, a different strain potentially on the East Coast and the West Coast. Studies saying that the strain that's in China appears different from the one in Europe. So if what you're saying is true, then are all those stories false, or are they just misunderstanding? They're like, how can those things be happening at the same time?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think we need to talk about the science of how they get at that. So, and this really, I think a good place to start is to go back to the first study that came out of China that was looking at, well, is there a virus? Okay. So what they did is they had only 9 people with a respiratory illness at first, and they got sputum samples or lung fluid where they actually put a tube down their lungs and squirted some saline in there and mixed it around and then sucked it back up. And so it had various things: cellular debris, free genetic material, any microorganisms that were present. So a big, mix of a bunch of stuff. And then they took that fluid, which had many different things in it, and they added an enzyme to dissolve any cell membrane so that the contents of the cell would be free in the solution. And then they started looking for genetic material and sequencing it. And they found some genetic material, right? Because there's sources would be, there would be lung cells, there could be immune cells from the host, there would be exosomes, which I'll tell you what those are in a minute. There'd be the normal bacteria and fungi that live in that part of the body, and then anything else that might be contaminating it. So they sequenced this genetic material, which was RNA, and it's been shown in other studies that there is free RNA in our lung fluid in a healthy person. And so without knowing the source of this genetic material, they sequenced it, and then they compared it to a sequence of another coronavirus, which was the SARS virus from 2003. And by the way, they learned about that one the same way. And then if you go back further, they learned about that one the same way, and the same way all the way to the earliest paper I could find that described this procedure. So they basically don't know the source of this genetic material, but they have a sequence. And they said that it's a coronavirus because it shared 79.6% of its sequence with this SARS virus that also we're not sure where that RNA came from either. Now, just taking that at face value, let's say the SARS RNA was accurate and it was a SARS virus. Well, 79.6% identical is not very identical. So how can they say it's the same family of viruses? Like, I'll give you another example. Humans and chimpanzees share 96% of our genetic sequence. So if you took my DNA and sequenced it, and you didn't know it was from me, you thought it was just from a random organism, and you looked at the sequence and then you ran it through the database and found it matches 96% chimpanzee, would you say that that DNA is from a chimpanzee? Right? That would be pretty ridiculous, right? I'm very different from a chimpanzee. And so how do you say that with 16% less identity that it's from a coronavirus? And then compound that, and you don't know what the source of the genetic material is because you didn't isolate a cell or a particle and then extract the genetic material out. And that's, by the way, would not be that difficult to do. So there are some good protocols that have been done in viruses found in bacteria. They're called bacteriophages. And basically, it's a simple procedure. You take the culture of bacteria, you stress it environmentally so that it makes bacteriophages. They come out when the environmental conditions are poor, just like in a disease state for us, like according to terrain theory. And then you take that mixture and you filter it. And filtering it is very key because particles that are called viruses are extremely tiny in the nanometer scale, like a billionth of a meter. And bacteria cells are much larger, and human cells are much larger than that. So basically, you're going to filter out any cells of other microorganisms, and you'll just have these particles. And then once you have those purified particles, and there is another step, you put it in a centrifuge so you get them in a tight band, and then you can take them out. And then you could, once you have them purified, and that's the only thing that's there, and you can verify it under the microscope that there's nothing else there, well, you could just extract the genetic material out of that. Then you'd know whatever that particle it is, that's where the RNA came from, right? And that would be a pretty straightforward procedure. So I wonder, like, I don't understand why they're not doing that procedure. Instead, what they do is, like I said, they just get that for the genetic material, and that's how they say it's a coronavirus in the first place, which is really far off, in my opinion. But then they take the lung fluid, a separate sample, and they mix it with a cell culture of some different kind of cells. Now, there's been like an adaptation of Koch's postulates for viruses called the Rivers criteria. And in that, it says you're supposed to culture it in a host cell. So basically, you could take some lung cells out of the person that you take the fluid out of and culture those and use that to culture the virus. But they never have done that. They use cells from monkeys, usually these cells called vero cells from a monkey kidney epithelium. But they also add antibiotics. And so this is really important because there is this thing called exosomes, which is secreted by all the cells in our body and in all mammals. It's definitely present in all mammalian cells. And even when we're in a healthy state, like we're always putting out some of these exosomes. And they're tiny little sacs of fluid, and they contain genetic material, and they contain receptor proteins, just like they say the viruses contain. And when you look at microscopic images of exosomes and viruses, it's impossible to tell the difference. Like they both come in different sizes and slightly different shapes and configurations. But if you look at the entire set of both of them, you'll see that they're essentially, you can't tell them apart. So when our bodies are under stress of various sorts, like we have an acute infectious illness, we're exposed to a toxic substance, we're exposed to ionizing radiation, we have severe psychological stress, it causes induction of the exosomes, and the body puts out more and more. And when you mix cells with antibiotics, it's been shown in several studies that that's one of the things that induces exosomes. So you take this lung fluid, mix it with monkey cells and antibiotics, those monkey cells are going to put out exosomes. So when you then, after you incubate that and grow it for days or a couple of weeks, and then look at it under the microscope, well, how do you know what the particles you're looking at are? Because there's definitely going to be exosomes there because you've created the situation to put out the exosomes. And so, like, they don't, in these papers, they don't show a picture in the microscope saying these are the exosomes and this is the virus. They only show one type of particle. So where are the exosomes? Because you know they're there, because that's what all the research shows, but yet they don't talk about it at all. They just say that that particle is a virus.
So, so what you're saying is that, and it's, to me, honestly, just as a layman here, it sounds like a really simple and dumb mistake to make. If exosomes, which those exist, that's not the controversial part of the theory of what you're proposing. Exosomes are a real thing, just for everybody listening. But the difference you're saying is that when they're looking for, a virus or for something, they're mistaking the exosomes for this invading force that they call a virus.
Yeah, well, I mean, they have to account for the exosomes because they're definitely going to be there. And they're not accounting for that at all. It's like they didn't even think of it for some reason. And most exosomes and viruses are so similar. Most of the researchers that look into exosomes are virologists. So I just don't understand how they could not realize this. And also, this doesn't fit at all with the procedures that have been laid out by the people in the past who said this is how you prove a virus causes disease. Like that Rivers criteria that I mentioned, it was basically an easing up of Koch's postulates because there were some things that were really hard to prove for viruses. So they made the things, and you see, like making a shortcut doesn't make things true, right? But even by those shortcuts, they haven't even come close to demonstrating anything because they're not using the same procedure. Like they have not, in one of these papers that I found, isolated a virus, because isolating it means to separate it from everything else. And instead, what they do is they mix it with everything else.
So is this kind of a compounded problem or one and the same with the issue with the PCR test that more and more people are talking about?
Yeah, it is, because if you isolated something like and purified it, so it's the only thing, then look at the genetic material in that only thing, you know the source of it. But if you take a mixture of a bunch of different things that all have different genetic material, well, how do you know what the source of it is? Right? And then here's another thing that is prevalent in the research on exosomes is that they have in exosome research, they are able to isolate and purify the particles, right? So why can they do it for exosome research, but not for the viral research? But when they do it in the exosome research, they've extracted genetic material straight from the exosomes, and they've found a mixture of human and viral DNA from various things that they called viruses. So how could viral DNA be in our own exosomes? In other words, I think they got this wrong from the beginning, and they called this DNA and RNA viral when actually it's our own. And so, but there's been so much, like it's been built on this for 30, 40 years since they were first able to sequence genetic material, that nobody's going back and looking at the original thing. And because exosomes have only been discovered about 30 years ago, and for a while there was a slow start to doing research, and it's really picked up in the last couple of decades. So you can almost see an exponential expansion of the papers on exosomes. But I haven't seen evidence that anyone's gone back and looked at the beginning of the virus research and asked the question, could we have been looking at exosomes all along? But there have been some researchers that say basically the virus and the exosome is the same thing.
Yeah, that's really intriguing. And okay, so I want to ask you a similar question to the last one, which is, I just wrote an article last week about a news story coming out showing that the U.S. was funding $3.7 million for a grant towards China to study coronaviruses involving bats in a cave 1,000 miles away from Wuhan. So if what you're saying is true, then what are they studying? What is the research actually going to? I mean, are they just studying exosomes, mistaking them for viruses? And how does that gel together?
Yeah, well, because they're working from this paradigm that viruses cause the disease, what their stated goal is that they want to identify other viruses that might cause illness in us, right? And so that's, that's the kind of research that gets a lot of funding. Like the amount of funding related to COVID-19 research is huge right now. I mean, it's a gold mine. So if you're a researcher and you want a grant, write a grant on COVID-19 and it'll get funded. But I think every paper that I've looked at where they've tried to identify or isolate a new virus used the procedure that I described, except for the papers looking at bacteriophages or other viruses in single-celled organisms like algae and amoeba. So like there's this one prominent virologist from Germany, his name is Stefan Lanka, and he actually discovered a virus in algae. But he actually observed that this virus was actually helpful to the algae to survive. Very much the opposite of our thought that the virus is destructive and causes disease. But after he made that discovery and published it, he wanted to look at the viruses involved in human disease because he thought that would be a useful thing to research for humanity. And when he started looking at this and looking at the papers, he actually recognized this error in the methodology. And he was like, there's no proof of any of these viruses. And he actually put a challenge out for measles that he was offering $100,000 to anyone who could prove that the measles virus existed. And someone I mean, several people tried to do this, but one was really persistent. And when Lanka told him he didn't give the proof, this guy sued him in court. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court of Germany. And they had to bring in expert witnesses, to weigh in on this. And the Supreme Court ruled in his favor that there was no proof for the measles virus. So what I'm saying has actually been proven in a court of law, interestingly enough, where it's not the best forum for science, but it's definitely significant.
So again, then that would mean that what the U.S. government or whoever, whatever organizations, basically anybody operating from this false assumption, as you put it, is basically studying the wrong thing. So they're looking for an invading force, but it's actually something coming from within the organisms that they're studying. And so I don't know, I guess, because I'm not committed fully to this theory yet. I've watched a few of your videos and I've been listening to talks, and that's what's so intriguing to me about it, because I think that, like a lot of science and history, we come to realize that there are things that we haven't been taught, or things that have been sort of covered up or kept from the public. And so I'm not averse to thinking that this could potentially have happened, whether that's by mistake or by design. But I see, I guess for me, and I don't know if these again can maybe be the same thing, it seems like this was some attempt at genetic engineering. Like, we continue to have more evidence that whatever it is, whether we call it a virus in the allopathic sense, or more in the sense of what you're describing, something coming from the organism itself, it seems like the US and China and potentially other nations, we definitely know that there's a history of bioweapon research. So one way or another, it seems like they're trying to weaponize and use this for military purposes. What are your thoughts on that? How are the two things connected? Or is the idea that there are bioweapons, is that the hoax? Is that the false part of this?
Right. Well, I haven't seen any evidence of any bioweapons that have been deployed and actually making people sick. But I acknowledge that this is an area that there's a lot of clandestine research. But I just want to clarify my point, because I'm very certain that the methods that they're using in the paper are not scientifically powered to prove what they're saying. And even the authors of the papers, in their conclusion, they write that the best they could say is that there's an association or an implication of the virus with this disease. They have not made the bold statement about cause. Like, nobody, the only papers I saw where they say cause, they actually are making it up. Like, they're just stating it, making a declarative statement, but there's no evidence that they reference to back it up. So it's important to realize that the authors themselves of these papers realize the limitations of their science. And that's mostly what I'm talking about, because I know how to design an experiment, and I know that you have to separate variables from each other. And when you mix a whole bunch of variables together, you can't learn anything from it. And so I know that methodology is flawed. I don't, my theory about the origin of that all viruses were actually mistaken for exosomes, I don't have proof of that, but I think there's a lot of supporting evidence, and it's a compelling hypothesis. As far as the bioweapons, I think it's good for me to tell you a little bit more about exosomes, because I think they could be exploited for this purpose, and possibly have, in the whistleblowing of Judy Mikovits. I'm not sure if you've heard of her, but she was a virologist inside the government and found out that they were, viruses in vaccines that could cause illness. So I'll tell you about that. But what exosomes, the function is that they are mainly thought to communicate remotely in your body, because, let's say there's a cell in your nose or your lung that is ill with some insult, and it needs to call on other systems of your body, either to prepare to deal with what's coming, or to provide some kind of support. It may go to the bowels and say, move stuff out quicker, or to the kidneys to filter the blood more to get the stuff out, for example. And so it has a couple of mechanisms to carry this out. One is that it has a receptor on its membrane, which is like a lock. It's like a key. And then it has a target cell. So let's say it's going to the kidney. So the kidney will have the lock that key fits. So it can't move on its own, just like viruses are purported. They have no locomotion. So it's passively traveled around in the blood until it basically finds the right match for its key. And then it can be taken up by that cell, and its genetic material can be processed in some way, either integrated into that cell or transcribed into RNA or to make proteins or whatever, that can change the physiology of the target cell. So this mechanism could be exploited if you were able to manufacture like exosomes and modify the genetic material or insert genes in there that you wanted to. And they could be something like oncogenes, for example, which are genes that are implicated with cancer. So if you wanted to engineer that in some way, I think it's possible with the current technology. And in fact, there's even mainstream scientific studies where they're trying to do things like that to deliver therapeutics. So that could always, be exploited on the dark side to deliver harmful things. So it could be filled with toxic materials like heavy metals, for example, because another property of exosomes is that they're known to take up toxins from the environment. So there's this great experiment that has really good visuals under the microscope where there are some human cells in a culture, and there's some bacteria that's making endotoxins, which, like bacteria can sometimes make toxins. Like that's what happens when we get food poisoning. We've eaten food that has a staphylococcus toxin in it. That's the most common. And so the endotoxins actually bore little holes in the cell and it leaks out its contents and dies. So when they put cells with the bacteria and the endotoxins, the cells died. When they put in cells that were making exosomes with the bacteria and the toxins, the exosomes actually gobbled up the toxins. And they showed this under the microscope. And those cells lived. So it has this protective function. So if you take a bunch of exosomes and put them around a toxic material and then collect them and inject them into a person, you're essentially delivering that toxic material to the person. So I think it could be exploited, but I have no direct knowledge at all that this is going on at all. But this kind of research that you described could actually be a way to develop that kind of technology. I'm not sure that's being used that way, but it's possible.
That's really interesting because if, like you said, again, obviously we don't have the documents to prove those theories right there. But if there is some research going into those areas, well, then what you've said about viruses being misidentified or misunderstood or even just misnamed could also be happening at the same time that they're studying exosomes for, the purpose you just mentioned. So yeah, I just, like I said earlier, I had to do a whiteboard on this because there's so many theories and things floating around. And obviously your work's been getting out there as well as others, and people coming at it from a range of different angles. I think I mentioned that I interviewed Dr. Stephanie Seneff of MIT talking about glyphosate and the potential for synergistic effects of people being affected by glyphosate and being sick and becoming sick from that. And then if some virus or whatever else comes along, then obviously they could be they could be in a weakened state. So there's a lot of theories and ideas being put forth right now, and I guess my main goal as I'm learning and sifting through these is to try to share this information with the audience and let you guys decide best what you think is happening. I do appreciate you sharing all the information that that we just went through. I thought that was very thorough, and I appreciate that. So anything else you want to, I did have one other question that we talked about earlier, but anything else on COVID-19 and viruses, exosomes, germ theory, terrain theory you want to reemphasize?
Well, I mean, I think my overall opinion is that this whole pandemic is a manufactured like public relations crisis, and that this poor research that gives maybe an association of some imaginary RNA sequence with a disease is just enough to get people really scared that there's a really deadly disease. And there's, all these things that they orchestrated, the tent cities, the closing the hospital beds, changing the procedures of EMTs, laying off all these healthcare workers. It was just, I think, much easier to create the appearance of a pandemic than to engineer some kind of, laboratory biological weapon that wouldn't be very easy to be detected, but that would cause real devastation. And then also, that once the cat is out of the bag and something like that, like it could hurt you. Like if you're the person putting it out there, you could be susceptible to it as well. Whereas if it's an imaginary crisis, then you're definitely not susceptible, and it's a lot less expensive and a lot easier to carry out. So really, that's my current thinking on what's really going on right now. And but breaking down and debunking the scientific methods really helped me confirm and validate that's an inaccurate assessment.
I appreciate that. And so the last question I want to ask you is totally unrelated to what we've talked about for the last little bit, but we met a couple of years ago briefly at Acapulco in Mexico, and obviously I'm in Mexico right now. I mentioned to you before the conversation that I came out here to Mexico looking for land and really trying to start moving towards off-grid and unplugging from the systems that I think both of us can recognize do not serve the people of America, or really of the world. And I know that agorism, agorism is something that you're interested in as well, and that you seem to be moving in a direction of wanting to look for land at some point in the near-term future, or in the future in general. Do you want to share anything about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I see what's coming, and already several of our rights have been stripped away, and it seems like that they're moving towards more of that, and they want to monitor our health state, right? And you have this contact tracing programs that are going on, and cell phone apps that tell you where you can access and where you can't. And I don't want to live in that kind of a society. For a long time, I've definitely realized the major downfalls of having a central authority in society. That first of all, I think it infantilizes people, because you always look to the authority to make the decisions for your own life instead of making your own decisions. And it's so easily corruptible, because when you have authority and power over the masses, I mean, history has shown us time and time again, right, that power corrupts. So I think the true nature of people is actually to cooperate with each other. And that if we were in small enough communities, that we could all cooperate together for a common good, and then we could interact with other communities, and we could have commerce based on equity, right, and fairness and generosity and cooperation, and that we don't need to have separate ourselves out into the rich and poor, or class structures or power structures. That we could actually all be equivalent in our ability to to live, prosper, to have wealth and such. And I think it's a much more natural way to live. And there's even plenty of anthropological research to back that up. I think there's even an ideal number for a community that's been determined through some social science. So, given this situation, like I wanted to move into a rural area off grid a few years ago, and was looking at properties, but it would have just been really difficult with the commuting situation with my kids' school. So I kind of put it off temporarily, but now, because of the situation, I'm feeling like now is the right time. So I'm actually looking at properties, and I need to stay in my area to be so my kids could be near their mother. Otherwise, I would probably consider going somewhere else, like perhaps another country. Although I do feel like my roots are here in the United States, and that I want to stand my ground. And even though it might be riskier, but it's also a risk to see what might happen in a foreign country when you're not part of the culture, or you don't know how their government is going to adopt some of these international policies. So there's no purely safe bet, but I've been really fortunate through my journey into sort of conspiracy material, and my complementary journey into spiritual development, that I've created this network of people that it's like a brotherhood, really. And there are several of us that want to do this together, and some of them are even willing to come up to where I am to make this happen. And we have lots of ideas about how we could form our own community, be totally off grid, grow our own food, hunt on our property, build our buildings, teach our children, and be productive, put out research and journalism out to the world to help get knowledge out there. And it seems like just a fantastic way to live.
Yeah, I'd say so. I think honestly, I mean, I completely agree with everything you said there. That I put a book out 2.5 months ago, before this whole crisis began, called "How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State," because of everything that you were describing, the things that we're now seeing come into fruition under the guise of fighting COVID-19. they've kind of been on the horizon for a while. Facial recognition, more mass surveillance, tracking, all these sorts of things. And with moving into the smart grid and 5G and the Internet of Things, they're only going to become more prevalent. So I was kind of already going in this direction, but this experience, this crisis has really, just cemented in my mind that whether this is the final step, on the march towards a totalitarian government or just a giant leap in that direction, that I really think our way forward is to decentralize into smaller groups and smaller communities that, as you said, can network and come together and build and try to build, the next stage of humanity, not focused on trying to overthrow these people violently or to assume that voting them out is going to do anything, but to build. And I agree with you 100%. I want to reemphasize that for me, the reason I'm in Mexico is to start laying the foundation for some of these networks of communities, because I do envision that if we are unable, which hopefully we are able, but if we are unable to turn things around, there are going to be family and friends and people I care about that might want to leave the United States, and it might become extremely difficult in the near-term future to long-term future. And I envision a time where a more modern underground railroad is going to become necessary. And so I'm kind of out here laying the framework and the foundation for that, and hopefully trying to inspire and work with people so that we can have communities in, New York, in Texas, in the West Coast, all across the US, as well as spread through Mexico. And if it's in any indication, recently we've been just overwhelmed with emails from people from all around the world who are now, because of this crisis, starting to focus on solutions, starting to want to talk about going off grid, growing their own food, unplugging from this healthcare system that you described so well earlier, and really starting to focus on building the next stage. So I do have hope and optimism, and it's really awesome to hear that you're thinking in those same terms as well. So I just appreciate everything you had to share today. And I'm not sure still where my mind is going to fall yet, but I do hope that we can maybe, as I dive in deeper for myself and for my channel, to have you back and for another conversation.
Yeah, I would love that. This is a real treat, and I really like what you're doing. And I even heard you talk about the Underground Railroad on James Corbett, and I think it's a fantastic idea.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone, please do check out his work, his YouTube channel. Everything will be in the show notes and the description below. And as always, please subscribe, like, follow. And remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free. Peace. Cool.